All right, this is part 2 of population ecology as we continue our look at this unit. The first thing that we're going to look at is this idea of life histories. This is a trait that is needed for a species in a particular environment in order to survive. Most species are typically one of two types of life histories, and one is called similarity. And similarity is kind of you want to think of like a big bang. This is where a species reproduces one time with large numbers of offspring, and the organism typically dies after reproducing. Tremendous amounts of time and energy and resources invested in making this offspring, and usually has to do with the fact that it's a harsh environment and there's a best time to reproduce. I have a picture here of a plant called a sensory plant. It reproduces once and it dies. Salmon are very popular, are very well-known species that has the same sort of thing. They are born and they swim out to the ocean and live a full life, and then when it's time to reproduce, they swim back to the place where they were born and lay a bunch of eggs and then die. And so that is their one thing. The other one is called iteroparity, and iteroparity is repeated reproduction year after year. This is what most organisms are doing. And it doesn't have to be that they reproduce every year, but that they could if they wanted to, or if environmental conditions were favorable. Lots of typically not as much resources used for reproduction in this particular instance. And so some species are very prolific, like pigs, of course, can just give birth all the time. Other species less often, but you get the idea here between the two. That leads us to two different growth models of populations. One of them is called exponential growth, and this involves a type of species that is called an R-selected species. An R-selected species, and think of R being rapid growth, and this is where the population size is related to resources, and if there's an abundant amount of resources, then that population will just continue to thrive and will not be limited at all. They produce a J-shaped curve. That's typically what it's referred to as a J curve, and you can kind of see that there. And the population is almost doubling every generation. You can see this here, the change in population, the change in time here. That's what this, we'll talk about those equations in just a moment. Here's another elephant population that is exponentially growing. And why would they exponentially grow? They're not being hunted. They have full resources, and so there aren't any limitations on their populations. One kind of species that typically uh, demonstrates this type of growth is called a pioneer species. They're the first species to move into a new ecosystem. We'll talk more about this when we talk about ecological succession in a later lecture. But these are species that are the first ones to move into an area and to be able to exploit all the available resources. Sometimes you'll see exponential growth called intrinsic growth, and this is just think of an intrinsic ability. The population can double each generation without any sort of limits on it, and it's just another word for that. Now, some equations that you should keep in mind. This is taken right off the AP Bio formula sheet, just to kind of give you an idea. This isn't anything but just some simple subtraction and division and multiplication. And so and we're going to learn about carrying capacity in just a moment. And so you can see these types of equations for exponential growth, which we just talked about, versus logistic growth, which we're getting ready to talk about, because logistic growth is limited by this thing called the carrying capacity, which let's talk about limited logistic growth. So logistic growth, this is growth that is based on a carrying capacity. These are not R-selected species, but these are called a K-selected species. And this is where the species is typically hovering around carrying capacity, which is usually represented by the variable K. These species numbers are about the number of species as opposed to the resources because there are a limited amount of resources. They typically produce what you see here is an S-shaped curve. It's kind of a loose S, but you get the idea. Where there's an environment with limited resources, species will demonstrate this type of leveling off. They will be capped because only a certain amount of species will survive. And this is good for a population because which ones will survive? Only the strongest will survive. Now, obviously, in our own population, we don't like to think about this, but among other animals and things, this is just the norm. The strongest survive, and it ends up being better for the whole population. Which leads me to this idea of the Ali effect and the extinction vortex. The Ali effect is a situation that occurs when you have a small number of organisms, and this low number typically reduces or produces something called inbreeding, and inbreeding is just where there's no variation and those same traits continue to be bred into the population. And so if there's no variation, what do you expect? There's no genetic variability. This is going to reduce fitness in the population, but reduce adaptability, which is going to lower the population, lower reproduction, back to or higher mortality. So you have a smaller population than you did before, and more inbreeding, more genetic drift. You get the idea. And this leads to this vortex, this extinction vortex. Typically, species that get caught in this aren't able to escape from it without some sort of external help.